Yeah, and then I think probably the third part of that would be sort of the impact of behavior, of identifying behavior. But what I learned ultimately, my dad was the president of the National Association for Self-Esteem. Most people probably don't even know there is that. And he was one of the first authors of Chicken Soup for the Soul. So for anybody that's probably above 35, that they would know that. But the power of positive thinking never resonated with me. And when I was young and I was 18 years old and I dropped out of college and I was diagnosed with an initial diagnosis of cancer, and it turned out to be shingles and a number of other things, I did start to understand quickly that, well, I don't know if positive thinking works all the time and that the data is anecdotal. I do know that negative thinking does work, and it works negatively. And one of the things is I would start at Alabama and I would start with the Jacksonville Jaguars and I would start with the Miami Dolphins. I started to realize, and even looking back to a young age, that nobody wants to be told to be positive. That positive thinking is probably the number one reason this industry has not grown in my 44 years of living. Positive thinking in many cases repulses people. You're telling me to be positive and I'm going through a divorce. You're telling me to be positive and I threw 3 interceptions. You're telling me to be positive and I got to deal with this president. You're telling me to be positive and I got this current situation. You're telling me to be positive and I got this health situation. So then what's the alternative? Well, the alternative has always been negative. So when we would get to the University of Alabama, you have this finite window of time. How long could you influence? Everything comes down to influence. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Whether it's your family, your kids, whatever the circumstance or the situations. So the NCAA gives you 22 hours to influence your players over a week. And so when you look at the human performance, you look at nutrition, you look at strength and conditioning, you look at fatigue science, you look at all these different things. Coach Saban believed that there had to be some emphasis on psychological education. And so how are we going to do that, and how is it going to be efficient? Well, most people think of sports psychology as treating somebody who has a problem. Nick Saban didn't look at it that way. He looked at, how do we make our best players better? How do we take great players and make them greater? And then how do we have an educational platform for all 120 players? And a college football team is a business. It's 120 employees, and you lose 35% of those employees every year. And it's an EBITDA-driven business where when you succeed, you get more sponsorship. And as you get more sponsorship, you make more money. And as you make more money, the school makes more money and everybody benefits. And it all happens from winning. But if your best players leave every year in that 35% and they take their great behaviors and their great habits and their great mindset with them, then you're in trouble. So you have to develop programmatics. You have to develop a system. I mean, you look at Quest and what you guys did, that ultimately when you were going to sell it or you're going to evolve, that there had to be, if we're going to create the ultimate metabolic type of food, or we're going to limit, like, the recipe has to be the same, so you're not the only one that can cook it. So ultimately, psychologically, we had to come up with a plan for everybody. I think that learning how to meditate and regulate your breath is important, but to me, I think that's AP chemistry, and we need an 8th grade version where we just know, okay, that there's a table of elements, and we need the basics. And so that's what we did. When we started to study, what we learned was that negative thinking was the most powerful element that our players were combating. That negative thinking was weaponizing them against them. So how's negativity carried? Well, is it your internal thoughts? Well, if you're dealing with trying to change internal thoughts, then you got to go to affirmations, and you got to go to imagery, you got to go to visualization. Very difficult skills. Well, we started to look at the externalization. Well, if somebody says something out loud, it's 10 times more powerful than if they think it. And then as we started to study the data, particularly data that was just reinforced by Christine Porath from Georgetown and Harvard, that negativity is a multiple of 4 to 7 times more powerful than positivity. So think about that. If I say something out loud, it's 10x. If it's negative, it's 4 to 7 times more powerful. So when I say negative things out loud, it's 40 to 70 times more likely that that will happen or cause a result that won't be good for me than if I just didn't say anything. So as we were going into our second year at Alabama, and we were going into our first year at Florida State, and we were ultimately going into our second year at the University of Georgia, we made a bet. What if we could just get our players to not say stupid things out loud? What if we could just do that? Not teach any element of positive thinking, but eliminate conversations about the Heat, complaining about coaches, complaining about circumstances, complaining about situations, verbalizing negativity. But we weren't going to lie to them and say, hey, be positive. We just taught them the data. And then what we did was some of the things that you noticed in the book, the stories in and around negativity are incredible.